Most players would call this position equal. Sindarov called it winning. This is Grandmaster knockout. Playing white, Sindarov. In the other corner, Vachier-Lagrave. Sindarov versus Vachier-Lagrave, and one of them is about to get knocked out. Watch closely. The turning point is easy to miss. Let's go. Sindarov, pawn to a4. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to e5. Sindarov, knight to f3. Vachier-Lagrave, knight to c6. Sindarov, bishop to c4. Vachier-Lagrave, knight to f6. Sindarov, knight to g5. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to d5. Sindarov, pawn takes d5. Vachier-Lagrave, knight to a5. Sindarov, bishop to b5, check. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to c6. Sindarov, pawn takes c6. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn takes c6. Sindarov, bishop to d3. Vachier-Lagrave, knight to d5. Sindarov, knight to f3. Vachier-Lagrave, bishop to d6. Sindarov castles kingside. Vachier-Lagrave castles kingside. Sindarov, rook to e1. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to f5. Sindarov, knight takes a5. Vachier-Lagrave, queen to f6. Sindarov, knight to f3. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to g5. Sindarov, knight to c3. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to g4. Sindarov, rook to b1. Vachier-Lagrave, knight to f4. Sindarov, bishop to f1. Vachier-Lagrave, bishop to d7. Sindarov, pawn to b4. Vachier-Lagrave, knight to b7. Sindarov, bishop to c4, check. Vachier-Lagrave, bishop to e6. Sindarov, rook takes a6. Vachier-Lagrave, knight takes a6. Sindarov, knight to g5. Vachier-Lagrave, queen takes g5. Sindarov, bishop takes a6, check. Vachier-Lagrave, king to g7. Sindarov, pawn to d4. Vachier-Lagrave, queen to f6. Sindarov, pawn to d5. Vachier-Lagrave, knight to d8. Sindarov, bishop to d7. Vachier-Lagrave, bishop to e5. Sindarov, knight to a4. Vachier-Lagrave, queen to d6. Sindarov, knight to c5. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn takes d5. Sindarov, pawn to g3. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to f7. Sindarov, bishop to a4. Vachier-Lagrave, knight to e6. Sindarov, knight takes a6, check. Vachier-Lagrave, queen takes a6. Sindarov, bishop to b3. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to d8. Sindarov, queen to d3. Vachier-Lagrave, queen to d6. Sindarov, bishop to g5. Vachier-Lagrave, bishop to f6. Sindarov, bishop to f4. Vachier-Lagrave, bishop to e5. Sindarov, bishop to g5. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to dd7. Sindarov, rook to a1. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to h6. Sindarov, bishop to d2. Vachier-Lagrave, king to h7. Sindarov, pawn to a3. Vachier-Lagrave, bishop to g7. Sindarov, bishop to f4. Vachier-Lagrave, queen to c6. Sindarov, rook to d1. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to d4. Sindarov, bishop takes f7. Vachier-Lagrave, rook takes f7. Sindarov, rook to a1. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to a6. Sindarov, bishop to e5. Vachier-Lagrave, queen to a6. Sindarov, pawn to c3. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn takes c3. Sindarov, bishop takes c3. Vachier-Lagrave, queen to b3. Sindarov, rook to a3. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to h5. Sindarov, bishop takes g7. Vachier-Lagrave, queen takes d3. Sindarov, rook takes d3. Vachier-Lagrave, king takes g7. Sindarov, rook to d6. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to a7. Sindarov, king to g2. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to a5. Sindarov, pawn to b5. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to c7. Sindarov, rook to a6. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to c3. Sindarov, rook takes a5. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to f4. Sindarov, pawn takes f4. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to h4. Sindarov, pawn to b6. Vachier-Lagrave, pawn to h3, check. Sindarov, king to f1. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to b3. Sindarov, rook to g5, check. Vachier-Lagrave, king to f6. Sindarov, rook takes g4. Vachier-Lagrave, king to f5. Sindarov, rook to g3. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to b1, check. Sindarov, king to e2. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to b2, check. Sindarov, king to e3. Vachier-Lagrave, rook takes b6. Sindarov, king to d4. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to b2. Sindarov, rook takes h3. Vachier-Lagrave, rook takes f2. Sindarov, king to c5. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to c2, check. Sindarov, king to b6. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to b2, check. Sindarov, king to a6. Vachier-Lagrave, king takes f4. Sindarov, pawn to a4. Vachier-Lagrave, king to a5. Sindarov, pawn to a5. Vachier-Lagrave, king to d6. Sindarov, rook to d3, check. Vachier-Lagrave, king to c7. Sindarov, pawn to h4. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to h2. Sindarov, rook to c3, check. Vachier-Lagrave, king to b8. Sindarov, rook to c4. Vachier-Lagrave, Rook to h1. Sindarov, king to b6. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to b1, check. Sindarov, king to a6. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to h1. Sindarov, king to b5. Vachier-Lagrave, king to b7. Sindarov, king to c5. Vachier-Lagrave, king to a6. Sindarov, rook to a4. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to d1. Sindarov, king to c6. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to d8. Sindarov, pawn to h5. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to c8, check. Sindarov, king to d6. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to h8. Sindarov, rook to h4. Vachier-Lagrave, king takes a 5. Sindarov, king to a7. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to h6. Sindarov, king to f7. Vachier-Lagrave, king to b5. Sindarov, king to g7. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to a6. Sindarov, pawn to h6. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to a7, check. Sindarov, king to g6. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to a6, check. Sindarov, king to g5. Vachier-Lagrave, king to c6. Sindarov, pawn to h7. Vachier-Lagrave, rook to a5, check. Sindarov, king to g6. Sindarov lands the knockout. Vachier-Lagrave has no answer. Think that was brutal? The next fight on screen is even worse. Tap it. Subscribe so you never miss a knockout.